So today the presentation will be by Guya Accornero. It has the title of Covering Spontaneity, Media Movement Relation in Austerity Portugal. And let me just briefly introduce Guya, who is assistant professor in political science at the Lisbon University Institute and a researcher at CIES in the same university. She coordinates the project HOPES, Housing Perspectives and Struggle, Future of Housing Movements, Policy and Dynamic in Lisbon and Beyond, and co-chairs the research network of social movements of the Council of European Studies. Her research is mainly on social movements with interests on radicalization protests and the role of protest in political change, digital activism, and gentrification and movements for the rights, for housing rights. She published in journals such as Mobilization, Social Movement Studies, Journal of Contemporary Religion, West European Politics, Democratization, Cultures and Conflict, to give you just a few of the many journals in which Guya has published.
That's all. That's all.
So there are a few more, but I'm just pointing to the ones that are most relevant in my view. She's also the author of the book The Revolution Before the Revolution, which studies the student movement before the revolution in Portugal. And very important as well, she's one of the co-editors of the book Social Movement Studies in Europe, A State of the Art. So I think probably this is enough to introduce Guya, and I'm not sure, I don't think I'm forgetting anyone, anything. So just briefly show you the page of our seminar here. Let me just share the screen, and so you can get more, for those who are come to this seminar for the first time. Let me just show you. I can't share the screen.
I can share if you maybe.
Just to give an idea of. Sure. Can I now?
You cannot.
No, I still can't. You disabled the participant screen sharing.
Mm-hmm. Now?
Okay. Yeah, should be able to do it now. Just to show you very briefly, for those who come to our seminar for the first time. Okay, you can see it now, right?
Mm-hmm.
So basically, our seminar has run, we have an English version, right?
Yeah, it's on the top on the left.
Okay. So the seminar is organized. This is actually the first seminar of this year. We didn't have a session in January, so and we had the last one was with Doug McAdam, who talked about Trump and the elections in the United States. We've been having many different seminars throughout the last year, with Mavish Hamad from LSE, with Martin Portos from the Carlos III University. Last year we had Donatella Della Porta as well, talking about how social movements can save democracy in the pandemic time. And so we've been having a lot of presentations around social movements and political action in Europe and beyond. So just to give you an idea of what we normally do with the seminar. And well, I think we can start maybe, no, Guya?
Mm-hmm. See,
okay,
the video of the seminars are all online since April. Also, if you're not able to follow the seminars, you can always spend time on Sunday watching the videos in your screen at home. Sorry, I have this double row today. It's a little bit strange, but so I can start.
Well, the floor is yours then.
Okay. So we are a little bit in a family today, so I can be easygoing, I think. Actually, I have to say that I had to improvise a little bit my presentation, in the sense that we have planned another presentation. After, unfortunately, the speaker couldn't make it, and so I found that in any case it wasn't. I like that we have continuity in our seminar, and also I wanted to take the opportunity to discuss this work I started some years ago, and that actually stayed there until now. So I haven't had time to come back to it and to reflect on what to do with it. So I found it will have been a good opportunity also to come back to it and let's restart reflecting also with your help. So the title is covering spontaneity, media movements, a relation in Austerity Portugal. In Austerity Portugal. So the object of this research that I mainly developed in the summer of 2018 is the interplay between traditional non-web-based movements, particularly the labor movement, and new web-based movements and the mass media, particularly TV journals, and during the Portuguese anti-austerity cycle of protest. I particularly focused on the role of framing processes in this interplay, and specifically in what is called identity frames. I also focus on claims, but particularly on identities. Just to give some introduction about the role of frames and the literature on frame that for sure many of you already know. So to frame is to select some aspect of a perceived reality and make them more salient in a communicating text in such a way as to promote a particular problem definition, causal interpretation, moral evaluation, and or treatment recommendation. So what is important in framing, and particularly in the use of framing process in social movements, is that the fact that the cleavages and the collective identities on which social movements are based they're not always pre-existing the collective action and the social mobilization. So many times social movements need to engage in the creation of their identity frames, and this is quite of demanding work, demanding task. Is an effort for social movement to strategically frame their identities, and this is critical and crucial in the mobilization process. For recruiting people and also to be effective in achieving support from other actors. The recognition, there is also another point, that the recognition of the framing, and particularly the identity framing of social movements by authorities and by mainstream media is something very important for the development of social movements and for their legitimation in the public sphere. And but this is always the result of a negotiation between the movements and the other actors. There are for sure literature say that usually there are certain aspects of social movements that traditional media, such as newspaper, TV news, etc., privilege in their covering of social mobilization processes. And in this sense, social movements have been seen as quite depending on mainstream media for the diffusion of their identity frames and claims, okay? And more than other actors, such as trade unions, for instance, and more organized actors, such as parties, etc. So Actually, if there was the literature on the media coverage of social movements was particularly developed with respect to previous cycle protests. More recently, and particularly in the case of anti-austerity cycle protests, but also in the case of all this wave of protests, the global wave of protests that included the Occupy movements, Arab Spring, etc., etc. Actually, we find very little studies on the role of mainstream media in covering anti-austerity protests. And that's because scholars mainly focus on the role of new social media in this cycle of protests. It was something not new, but it was the cycle of protests where actually we saw a big explosion of the use of new social media for mobilizing. These are some of the studies. Actually, there are many of them that are on Portugal. Two of them were realized by Valentina Alexandre, one of them with our colleague Britta, our colleague and friend Britta, and another one is a study that I realized on the that it was part of this book coordinated by Tau Papayoannou and Suman Gupta on media representation of anti-austerity protests in the European Union. But actually, the field of the mainstream media coverage of anti-austerity protests is not so developed as the field of the role of new social media in this cycle of protest. Actually, continue looking at the role of mainstream media in protests is quite important, and I think it's very important and interesting, particularly if you try to analyze the impact that new media have had on the relation between social movements and mainstream media. Because if we, until some years ago, scholars detected a strong dependence of social movements on the mainstream media for diffusing their identities, claims, for recruiting people, for organizing, etc. Now we can see that this relation changed, and this change is mostly due, according to many scholars, to the increasing role of new media. So the social movements are no more so depending on mainstream media, because they have their own media to communicate with people, and these media are also used to communicate with mainstream media. In many cases, the same mainstream media themselves, they rely on social movements communication tools such as blog, Facebook pages, Twitter accounts, etc., etc., to find news on the movement. So the relationship, it looks completely inverted. So internet communication technology strengthened the social movement's capacity not only to manage their own mobilization processes, but also the image of the mobilization. And this was also detected by Koopmans already in 2004, when he said that indigenous networks and movement media are crucial as internal channels of communication and as counterbalance to the media images of a movement. Many scholars, also starting from Castells, that developed the first studies about indie media, that it was the first big digital platform used by social movements. And he defined the indie media such as a network of network. And also in following studies, this was the first example of the social movements becoming a source of news. So that not only demonstrators and activists and many people interested in the mobilization process around the world look at the social movements pages, web pages, and digital tools to understand what's happening around the world, but also other actors such as journalists of mainstream media, different opinion makers, etc., look at the social movements as a source of news. And these are completely different relationship in respect to before. So the presentation of today is based particularly on 3 studies. 2 of them were published. The first one already mentioned, and this in this study I analyzed what I call it the framing competition between anti-austerity movements in Portugal and mainstream media, and I particularly focused on the Geração Arasca movement, and I analyzed the way the frames of this movement were reported by the by mainstream media, particularly newspapers. I chose 3 newspapers, and I follow it 3 years, and particularly according to the terms of precariousness, spontaneity, certain specific identity frames used by the Geração Arasca movement. And I discovered that actually they were completely faithfully reproduced in the mainstream media without any filter, like completely almost full sentences reproduced directly in the mainstream media. This is another study I developed with colleagues at the CIES-Iscte that was published in this other book, Your Crisis. And we diffused a survey, a little survey in Italy, Portugal, Spain, and France, to understand to what extent people use the digital networks for mobilizing in respect to different, or for participating in mobilization. And our results show something that Mark Bassinger already was demonstrated, looking at particularly at Arab Spring, that countries that usually have a lower weaker traditional civil societies rely more on virtual civil society tools such as digital networks, etc., etc. For instance, France participants in social movement, in mobilization, different kind of mobilization, don't use too much. French people don't use too much a digital tool in respect, for instance, to Spaniards. The last study that is more at the core of what I'm doing today is unpublished, and I hope to submit to some journal in the future, and is about this comparison about the way mainstream media, in this case TV news, cover specific protest events during the cycle of protest in Portugal. Events organized by 2 different actors, trade unions and new social movements such as Geração Arasca and Kesserisha Troika. So the starting point of this analysis is that Tiago, can you tell me what time is it? To give me the time when I'm approaching to the end, just to...
Sure.
Thank you. Because maybe I am talking too much, but okay.
10 minutes, more or less 10 minutes now.
Okay, thank you. So anti-austerity movement in Portugal have some advantages in respect to previous movements, or at least apparently advantages. First of all, we can see that activists, particularly the organizers, can be defined as high-skilled activists. So, in particular, they are particularly skilled in any kind of field related to communication. So, communication of this movement is highly professionalized, and many of them have a degree or a master even in journalism, in design, or in some kind of field related to communication. On the other side, they show personal contacts to mainstream media because of different kind of structural condition in the country, to be a country particularly centralized, where the role of cities is very important, and where the educated elite is not so big. So there are kind of conditions, there are certain conditions that are, make the contacts between these people more frequent in respect to other countries. So this can be seen as advantages for managing the communication of social movements, but the question is a real advantage? And because we know that when even many of us and what we read in a newspaper or what we hear in during TG News, etc., many times is an association between social movements with inorganical. For instance, there is this adjective of inorganical that I still need to understand exactly what it means, but it looks something completely I don't know, coming from nowhere, and spontaneous, independent from any kind of structure, etc. So what seems to be an element that help social movements to gain attention and coverage by mainstream media is something that is not really professionalization. So we can challenge this idea that the professionalization in communication is important. If actually there is this idea that what people want to see in social movements is exactly the opposite, is them to be spontaneous, emotional, etc., etc. And this is what Soberai, this is at the core of this study of Soberai, very good study. So she said that highly professionalized information might backfire on social movements because they are expected to be less professional, more spontaneous and emotional. And this also reminds the argument, very important, of Berta Tyler in her famous article on social movements continuity, the women's movement in abeyance. And she criticized this idea, this notion of social movement, that she called the myth of immaculate conception of social movements. So the social movements are required to be like coming from nowhere, emerging from nothing, completely spontaneous. Okay, this is quite curious that these elements of spontaneity are so strong and so underlined and valorized, because we know that all social movement theory exactly was created against this, because this idea of spontaneity and irrationality was exactly what made social movements illegitimate actors in the public process. And this was exactly why scholars such as Doug McCadden was here in December, Charles Tilios, Netaro, or others developed all their work. So it's a quite interesting paradox in my view, this valorization of spontaneity, but on the other side, we have highly skilled activists. How these work? So this study aimed to analyze how news media, and particularly in TV news, cover the anti-austerity cycle of protests, particularly strikes and new anti-austerity movements. I analyzed the position that protest events have among the news, if and how the social movements frames are reported, and in which way the element of spontaneity interplay with all this process. So I choose 3 general strikes and 3 protest actions organized by new anti-austerity movements. I follow 3 public channels, RTP 1, 2, and 3, and 2 private channels, CIEC and TVE, including the sub-channels of CIEC News and TVE 24. And I watched all the TV news during the day of the event, the day before, and the day after, okay, in order to understand the resonance of the event. And I have to thank the laboratory of communication of Iscte that allowed me to use the database. And there were this number of hours of news that I spent watching in the summer 2018. So this is the research design. I took note of the number of minutes of that the event, that the TV channel dedicated to the event in the 3 days. If the event was among the first 3 news pieces, how much time the activists who talked, how much time other participants of the protest event talk, so around people participating in a demonstration, if the news pieces were talking and communicating something about the organizers and the claims, and comparing this with the manifestos, the press statement, the claims on the website, etc. If the frames of the protesters were reported, in which way the protest was and the protesters were framed, if troublemakers, peaceful, etc., etc. How was the event talked about? If it was more about the numbers, the infrastructure, state organization, and the general position toward the protest. Okay, I start with the general strike. The general strikes called a very high quantity of time, a lot of time of coverage in all the TVs. In the paper, I have more discrimination in respect to the different TV also. There are certain slight difference between public TVs and private TVs that I didn't want to bring here because it was a little bit a different aspect. But in general, what is common in all the channels is that we can see an insistence. So now the strikes affect other citizens, and not other citizens in general, but exactly the same other citizens that are supposedly the directed people that trade unions would like to defend, like poor people, minorities, small retailers, immigrants, workers. For instance, I remember many interviews with single mother, and many of them of some minority, particularly Black single mother, that for instance, during the strike at school, they couldn't. So they couldn't go to work because they had to stay with the kids during the day of the strike because the schools were closed. So a lot of kind of interviews of this kind, a lot of interviews of this kind. No claims or frames of the strikers are reported, no interview with the strikers and the protesters. So this is very important because the only interviews were with the organizers, and this underlined the idea of these events being strongly vertically organized, because not interviewing the random participants and the protesters or the workers, etc. But only the organizers transmit immediately an idea that is a completely superstructured and vertical event, okay? And no reference to the claims, to the revendication, and no comments by the journalist. The coverage of new anti-austerity movements was completely different, much more sympathetic and positive position. I collected really the adjective associated to the events. The identity frames were also in this study. Also, this study showed that the identity frames were carefully reproduced. And this is the same that I detected analyzing the newspaper. And identity frames were spontaneity, independence from parties and other organizations, transversality, the intergenerational dimension, the pacific attitudes, the values of the revolution, and the transnational dimension, and the strong relevance of the internet communication technology, in the sense that there are many, there is someone that has the, I can hear some noise, but oh, sorry. There is a strong insistence from the mainstream media, on the side of mainstream media, and this is completely taken in a critical way from the social movements framing of their identity, that internet communication technology are a way for them to be horizontal, not hierarchical, not vertical, spontaneous, independent from parties and other organizations, not situated on the left or on the right axis, etc., etc. So this insistence is exactly the opposite of insisting on the organizers in the case of trade unions, demonstrations, and events. The discussion and reflection on the claims, so they are related to the austerity effect, are also very relevant. Also through the many interviews with public figures such as, for instance, Boaventura de Sousa Santos, and many others. Many interviews with activists, not only organizers, but also activists and common participants. And this really give an idea of being this give an idea of horizontality, is trying this image and identity of horizontality. So we can see the strikes get much more attention in terms of quantity of the amount of minutes dedicated to the events in respect to anti-austerity demonstrations, but it was a quite different kind of coverage. So what I can conclude in a very preliminary way, that new forms of mobilization in Portugal, particularly focused on precarious net frames and led by highly skilled activists, were particularly effective in attracting the media attention and in seeing and in making that the movement claims and identity frames were carefully and faithfully reflected in the media news. And traditional forms of mobilization had large coverage, but no claims, frames, or identity description. And also an insistence on the hierarchical and verticality of the events and of the mobilization. So new social movements gain less time but faithful, positive and sympathetic coverage, and the reproduction of the identity frames of the movements, with direct references even to the social networks of the movements where these frames were reported and where the journalists went to take inspiration for her article. So the point is that it looks that the argument of spontaneity, that is part of the careful, so in this highly skilled activist work, actually is also to, in a certain way, cover the professionalization through the image of spontaneity. So spontaneity in this case requires a careful work of construction through professionalized skills. And so the argument of spontaneity doesn't work in respect to professionalization, because these high skills of the activists are valorized. Nobody criticizes in the newspaper and in the TV news these activists for being so trained in communication and etc., etc. This doesn't put in discussion their spontaneity. What is important and that is valorized in the mainstream media is the spontaneity in respect to their presumed independence from structured organization. So what really is valorized and considered a value, relevant factor and positive factor for the new social movements, new social movements, is the fact that they are supposedly independent from any kind of vertical structure organization. So they are spontaneous in this sense. And I stop here, and that's all. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Guya, for the very interesting presentation. And we have still a lot of time for questions and discussion, so I would open the floor if someone wants to come forward and ask questions to Guya or make any comments. Seems everyone is a bit shy, but please come forward.
There is no problem. I was chairing a panel 2 hours ago, and it was the same. I think that Zoom is not helping in this situation.
Guya, olá.
Olá, Luca.
Eu tenho uma pergunta, não sei se cabe muito bem aqui, mas eu não sei, eu queria entender mais ou menos, você acha que a cobertura da mídia portuguesa dos movimentos sociais, ela tem alguma relação com o fato de Portugal ter vivido relativamente recentemente a ditadura do Salazar?
But sorry, Luca, I answer in English because...
sorry.
No problem.
Okay.
It's not, I think we are mostly Portuguese speaking, but since we upload the video on the YouTube channel.
Okay, if you want, I can do the question again in English.
Whatever.
Okay. No, I was thinking, and I want to ask to you, do you think the media cover of the social movements in Portugal is connected, like the kind of media coverture is connected with the dictatorship process in Portugal?
I never thought about this. It's a good question. For sure, well, what is sure is that the studies that exist, some of them, they say that social movements are more legitimate actors in Portugal from institutions, because there was a revolution. So because of the process of democratization occurred through a revolution and not through a the transition, pacted transition as the Spanish one. So I don't know if this also impacted the way mass media cover social movements, but I don't think so, because this doesn't explain the difference between, let's say, traditional social movements such as labor movement and new movements. So this wouldn't explain this, but for sure, I had some difficulties, and maybe some communication scholar can help me in finding in Portugal a good story of the media, a kind of handbook of Portuguese media in the history, something like this that maybe could help me to explain some of this point. But it's a good point to reflect on, I think, Luca. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Well, maybe I ask one.
See, we also don't need to arrive to the end of the time.
Yes.
No,
I was thinking that in your presentation, you seem to stress that there is a relation between, this apparently spontaneous social movements that are highly professionalized and are, you know, very, you know, and very easily perform spontaneity, but so they have a very close relationship with the press and with the mass media, but you know, you didn't say anything about the trade unions. Do the what is the relationship between the trade unions and the mass media? Is it something, you know, do they put special effort in trying to have a good image out there, or as the social movements did, they need that emphasis in the mass media to be to gain coverage, or not?
This is a good point, and I think it will make sense to, because what I can do. Yeah, I didn't study particularly if there is some effort from social movements to influence mass media in mainstream media. It's not that I studied this. Of course, we know that there are contacts, because there are when you make interviews, you understand this, and also is quite. There are direct contacts, and also because it's so simple, they grew up together in the same schools, they did the PhD or the master in the same universities, or the bachelor, let's say, they were colleagues. So it's a kind of, I think it's a more a kind of effect of daily interactions and socialization in the city of Lisbon, for instance, or Porto, but mainly Lisbon, than a result of explicit effort. Of course, there is an effort on the side of social movements to create their identity, and this is and to strengthen their identity publicly. But this, I sincerely don't think that this was specifically directed to the mainstream media. It was, and in this sense, what usually was for trade unions until now was considered an advantage, so that they weren't so depending on the mainstream media, because they had their own channels of communication with authorities, with supporters, etc. Now that there is all this attention towards the protest feed by mainstream media, can be a disadvantage at this point. But it will be interesting to understand this, to make some more interviews. Maybe it will be interesting to make interviews to selected actors in the two movements, and with the two actors, and try to understand this point. Thank you, Tiago.
Okay, thank you. Do you have anyone else wants to ask a question?
If there are not a problem, I can also see many of my students here that they will also see me later.
Okay, if that's the case, maybe we can maybe close the session for now, and thank Guya for her presentation today. And just a small, a quick reminder that the next presentation, the next seminar will be exactly in a month, and we will have a presentation about Algeria by Sabri Ben Ali Sherif, and well, if no one has anything else to say, or I don't know if Guya wants to add anything.
No, thank you. Thank you.
Well,
thank you for coming. Thank you for coming.
I will thank Guya and for everyone to be present, and I'll close the session for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Guya.
Thank you.
Thank you.